The dress itched against her skin, a relic pulled from a beige box that smelled of mothballs and forgotten summers. Isla smoothed the lace with trembling fingers, though no matter how carefully she tried, the fabric still whispered of captivity rather than celebration. She was only 19, and yet here she was, standing in front of a mirror that seemed to reflect not a bride, but a girl already buried beneath decisions made by others. The house she was leaving behind offered no comfort. Her aunt had thrust the dress into her arms that morning with a clipped, "Put this on, he'll be here at 5. No warm wishes, no tenderness, only the familiar coldness that had raised Isla like frost on a window pane. When the black car arrived, gleaming as if even dust was afraid of its surface, Isla's stomach clenched. The driver stepped out, stiff and silent, and behind him stood Dominic Hale. He was taller than she imagined, his presence stretching into the air like a shadow that couldn't be ignored. His dark hair, streaked with gray, gave him an ageless quality, and his eyes, sharp, unreadable, fixed on her with a gaze that felt like a measurement rather than a greeting. He didn't smile. He didn't soften. He only nodded once, and in that moment Isla realized that whatever awaited her, it would not be love at first sight. It would not be anything she could have chosen. The ceremony passed in a blur, the words tumbling over her head like waves she couldn't fight against. The ring slid onto her finger, cool and heavy, not a promise, but a golden shackle. When she whispered her "I do," her voice cracked, fragile enough to break if anyone had leaned in to listen closely. Dominic's voice, by contrast, was deep, steady, and frighteningly composed. If anyone saw her pale face and shaking hands, no one acknowledged it. Hours later, as the car wound through the gates of his estate, Isla sat pressed against the window, her body stiff with dread. The mansion loomed ahead, an edifice of stone and light that looked more like a fortress than a home. Inside, marble floors echoed under her shoes as servants bowed their heads, their faces polite masks. Dominic led her down corridors lit with chandeliers, his stride steady, his silence deafening. Her heart thudded painfully. She knew what came next. A wedding night, a consummation, the final sealing of a contract she had never agreed to. She braced herself, every muscle tensing as he opened the door to a room so vast it made her breath falter. A canopy bed with heavy curtains dominated the center, sheets crisp and waiting. She couldn't move. She couldn't even breathe as he stepped inside behind her. For a long moment, silence pressed between them. Then Dominic spoke, his voice low, even, but startling in its gentleness. "You don't need to be afraid of me, Isla." Her head jerked slightly, but she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. He continued, "You don't have to do anything tonight, or tomorrow, or ever, unless one day you want to." The words hit her harder than any touch could have. She turned at last, disbelief widening her eyes. There was no hunger in his gaze, no triumph at his power, only a weary restraint, as though he too was trapped in this arrangement, though in a different way. Isla's breath caught. The dread she had carried since morning did not vanish, but it loosened, just enough to let her lungs fill again. She lowered her gaze, nodding almost imperceptibly, and sank down onto the edge of the bed. Dominic walked past her, setting a folded blanket on the sofa across the room. Without another word, he stretched out there, turning his back to her as though to prove he meant what he'd said. For the first time in years, Isla felt something unfamiliar pulse through her chest. Not joy, not hope. Something smaller, quieter, but no less powerful. Relief. And with it, the faintest crack in the walls she had built around her heart. She lay back, still clothed in lace, staring at the canopy overhead. The silence no longer felt like a cage. It felt like possibility. The room was too large for her to feel safe. The chandelier hung above like a crown of light, but it only deepened the shadows in the corners. The bed was dressed in silk sheets that seemed untouched by human warmth. Isla stood in the center, clutching her hands together, unsure of where to place herself in this world that was now called her home. Dominic walked in with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove. He did not glance at the bed nor at her. Instead, he carried a book in one hand and a folded blanket in the other. His silence was heavier than any words could be. He set the blanket on the leather sofa that stood against the wall and began to arrange it as if this were a routine he had long practiced. Isla swallowed hard. The stories whispered to her by her aunt had painted him as a man of power, a man who always got what he wanted, but now he seemed intent on building a wall of distance rather than pressing forward with ownership. The contrast rattled her more than any threat could have. She finally found the courage to ask softly, "Are you going to sleep there?" Dominic looked up from the pillow he was adjusting. His eyes found hers and held them steady. "Yes, this is your room. You need to feel safe in it." The words should have soothed her. Instead, they unsettled her even more. No one had ever said something like that to her. Not her aunt, not her uncle, and certainly not the man who now called her wife. For a moment she wondered if this was some trick, a slow method of breaking her defenses, but his tone held no sharpness, only certainty. He lowered himself onto the sofa and opened the book. The crackle of the fireplace was the only sound filling the space. Isla sat on the edge of the bed, her body still wrapped in lace. She did not know whether to feel insane, altered by his refusal to claim her or relieved by his refusal to hurt her. Time stretched thin. The clock on the wall ticked in a rhythm that sounded louder with each passing second. She lay back eventually, her hair spilling across the pillow. The canopy above framed her like a cage, but there was something else in the air now, a fragile sense of control, a choice she had not expected. Across the room, Dominic turned a page. His voice broke the silence unexpectedly. "You do not have to fear the night. I do not take what is not offered." The sentence lingered in the air, curling around her like smoke. She turned her face toward him, wanting to respond, but the words froze on her tongue. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the sound of his voice echo in her head. That night, she did not dream of escape. She did not dream of love either. But when the morning came, Isla realized something had shifted. She was no longer just a pawn moved by others. She was a mystery even to herself. And the man who was supposed to be her captor was becoming the first person she could not predict. The mornings in the Hale mansion carried a silence that unsettled Isla more than the noise of her old life ever had. The air smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood. The staff moved like shadows, appearing only when necessary, never lingering long enough to feel human. She sat at the long dining table, staring at the untouched food before her. Plates lined with fruits and breads she had never asked for yet were placed before her as though they were offerings. Dominic was never there at breakfast. She learned quickly that he left before dawn, his world outside the mansion consuming his hours and perhaps his soul too. Still, every morning without fail, a small porcelain cup of chamomile tea appeared at her side, steaming just the way she liked it. She had never mentioned her preference to anyone. She wondered how he knew. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, but then came the books. She had offhandedly spoken the name of a novel she once dreamed of reading, and the next evening the book appeared on her dresser. No note, no explanation, only the quiet presence of something she desired. Her heart ached with suspicion. Was he trying to win her? Was this part of some unspoken game, or was he simply listening more closely than anyone ever had? One afternoon she wandered through the endless corridors, the marble floors reflecting her hesitant steps. She found herself outside a pair of tall doors carved with vines. She pushed them open and discovered the library, a cavern of leather-bound books stretched up to the ceiling with ladders leaning against the shelves. The scent of paper, ink, and dust wrapped around her like a forgotten embrace. She touched the spines of books like they were old friends she had been too poor to visit. She heard a sound behind her, Dominic's voice, deep and even. "You can read anything here. This is yours, as much as it is mine." She froze, feeling the words sink under her skin. This is yours. No one had ever given her anything without conditions. She turned to face him. His suit was perfectly cut, his presence towering, but his expression was unreadable. She forced herself to speak. "Why are you doing this?" His eyes lingered on hers for a long moment. Then, with a calmness that both frustrated and intrigued her, he said, "Because someone should." That night, Isla could not sleep. The wind rattled the windows and the mansion groaned under its own weight. Her mind replayed his words. She should have been afraid of his power, afraid of the trap she had been forced into. Yet something was shifting slowly, like a lock turning in her chest. She walked to the balcony in her nightgown, the cold air biting her skin. The gardens below spread out in perfect symmetry, bathed in pale moonlight, and for the first time since stepping into the Hale mansion, she felt the faintest flutter of something she had not dared to name. A question, not an answer. Could safety and danger live in the same man? Could the chains she wore turn into a key? Behind her in the dark hall, she thought she heard the soft creak of leather as Dominic closed his book alone on the sofa. He had not touched her. He had not demanded her. He had only listened, and that silence was becoming more powerful than any command could ever be. The clock struck 3 in the morning and the mansion breathed with the heavy silence of sleep. Isla jolted awake, her chest heaving, sweat clinging to her skin. The nightmare had returned, the one she could never outrun. The screech of tires on a wet road, her mother's sudden scream, her father's hand slipping from hers, then the silence of a hospital bed, too white, too empty. She pressed her palms over her ears as if she could stop the memory from echoing through her bones. She didn't realize she had cried out until the door opened. The soft click of the handle cut through her sobs. Dominic stepped inside, wearing only a dark shirt and loose trousers, his hair slightly disheveled as though sleep had abandoned him too. His eyes scanned the room, not with anger, not with hunger, but with an unsettling calm. He crouched beside her bed, his elbows resting on his knees. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Nightmare. Isla's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to form words. Her body trembled so violently the sheets twisted around her like ropes. Dominic did not rush to comfort her. He did not touch her right away. Instead, he weighted his presence steady like an anchor in the storm. Finally, he laid one hand lightly across her back, the weight, gentle, patient. It was not a claim. It was permission to breathe. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. The question startled her more than the dream itself. No one had ever asked her that before. Not her aunt, not her uncle, not anyone who claimed to care. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then let the truth spill in, broken fragments. I was with them in the car. It was the last trip we took together. The smell of the countryside, the radio, my father promising a new beginning, and then darkness. When I woke up, they were gone. Her words dissolved into sobs. Dominic did not interrupt. He did not feed her empty comforts. He simply listened, his eyes fixed on her as though nothing else in the world existed. In that silence, she felt her grief laid bare and still accepted. The weight of years poured out in moments she had never dared to speak aloud. "Sometimes I think I survived only to suffer," she whispered, as if the confession itself were dangerous. His jaw tightened, his own breath unsteady. Then he said something that made her heart stutter. "You survived because you still have something to live for, maybe something that has not yet found you." The air between them shifted. Isla raised her gaze, meeting his for the first time without fear. There was no pity in his eyes, only recognition, as if he too knew what it meant to carry an absence that never healed. For a moment she felt less alone. "Can I stay here?" he asked, not moving closer, not assuming. She hesitated, then pulled the blanket aside just a little. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed. His body remained distant, but his presence filled the space around her like a shield. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the accident, she did not cry herself to sleep. She drifted off to the sound of steady breathing beside her, a rhythm that promised she no longer had to face the darkness alone. The following afternoon, the mansion's gardens stretched before Isla like a labyrinth of secrets. Marble paths wound through perfectly cut hedges, fountains whispered in the distance, and the air carried the faint perfume of roses. She had wandered farther than usual, her shoes brushing dew from the grass until she came upon a cherry tree standing alone at the heart of the garden. Its branches reached for the sky, pale blossoms trembling in the breeze. Beneath it sat Dominic, a notebook balanced on his lap, his glasses low on his nose. His pen moved slowly across the page as if each word cost him a piece of himself. For the first time, she saw him not as the untouchable billionaire, not as the stranger who shared her roof, but as a man bent under the weight of his own silence. She hesitated, unsure if she should intrude, but he lifted his head before she could turn away. His gaze softened unexpectedly. "Do you like it here?" he asked, pointing to the bench beside him. Isla lowered herself onto the wood, still warm from the afternoon sun. "It is beautiful," she murmured, her eyes following the drifting petals. He closed the notebook and traced the spine with his thumb. My wife chose this tree years ago. The word wife cut through the air like a blade. Isla turned to him, uncertain whether to apologize or remain silent, but the way he said it held no bitterness, only a quiet echo of something lost. "Do you still miss her?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked at the blossoms for a long time. "Every day," he replied, "but not the way people think. It is not pain anymore. It is absence, like a room I never open but always know is there." The confession startled her. His words mirrored the hollow space in her own chest, the absence of laughter, the perfume of her mother, the voice of her father. She swallowed hard. "I sometimes feel guilty," she admitted. "Guilty that their faces are fading, the sound of their voices, In a way they held me slipping away like sand through my fingers. Dominic's expression shifted, the steel in his eyes melting into something she had never seen before. "Time does not erase love, Isla," he said. "It only changes the way we hold on to it." Her throat tightened and a single tear escaped down her cheek. She turned her face away, embarrassed, but he did not pretend not to notice. He did not shame her. Instead, he let the silence stand like a bridge between them, a silence filled not with distance but with understanding. The wind picked up, scattering petals around them. One landed on his sleeve and he brushed it away with an absent motion. Isla found herself studying him, the sharp lines of his face, the shadows beneath his eyes, and for the first time she wondered how many battles he had fought alone, how many rooms of absence he carried within him. Neither of them spoke again, but the quiet was no longer unbearable. It was a fragile bond born from loss and carried by recognition. A bond that whispered they were no longer just strangers bound by a contract, but two souls circling the same wound. And as the sun slipped lower behind the mansion, Isla realized that this man whom she had feared might also be the only one who could understand her pain. The mansion at night held a different kind of breath. The corridors whispered with echoes, the chandeliers dimmed into shadows, and the air seemed heavier with secrets. Isla wandered barefoot down the staircase, drawn by a sound she had never heard in these halls before. Music, a melody so soft it seemed to rise from the walls themselves. She followed the sound until it led her to a half-open door. A glow of lamplight spilled into the corridor. Inside, she saw Dominic seated at a grand piano, his fingers gliding over the keys with a grace that startled her. He was not the rigid figure in an immaculate suit. He was bare of armor, his face touched by something she had never seen. Vulnerability. She lingered in the doorway, afraid to disturb him, but a soft note faltered and he lifted his head. Their eyes met, and instead of retreating, he gave a faint smile. "Did you like it?" he asked, his voice lower than the music. "I did not know you played," she whispered, stepping closer. He shifted slightly, making room beside him on the bench. She hesitated, then sat there, shoulders brushing lightly. The warmth of his presence unsettled her more than any threat could. "I have not played for anyone in a long time," he said. His fingers rested on the keys, unmoving but ready, as if waiting for permission. She glanced at him and found her voice unsteady. "Why did you stop?" He exhaled slowly. "Because music was a language I only shared with someone who is no longer here." When she left, the notes turned into silence. The pain behind his words was quiet but sharp. Isla's chest tightened. She thought of her parents and the way silence had become her companion too. She reached out, almost without thinking, and pressed one key. A single note rang clear between them. He looked at her, surprised. Then slowly, almost cautiously, his hands joined hers, building the melody again. This time it was not a song of loss, but of something fragile beginning to grow. They played in uneven harmony, her hesitant touch against his seasoned skill, yet somehow it worked. The room filled with imperfect beauty. When the last note faded, they sat in silence, not daring to move. The air was heavy with something unnamed. Dominic turned to her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "You know you are very different from what I imagined." Her lips parted. "What did you imagine? Someone fragile, someone breakable. But you are not." He paused. "You are still here, even after everything." Her breath caught. She felt the distance between them collapse, though neither of them moved closer. It was not a kiss, not yet, but the possibility of one hung in the air like a storm about to break. Isla's heart pounded so loudly she thought he might hear it. She looked down at the keys, afraid of what might happen if she kept looking at him. For the rest of the night, the melody lingered in her chest. She had come to expect coldness and control, yet what she found in that room was music that spoke of longing and restraint. Music that whispered she was no longer invisible and that perhaps she had never truly been alone. The night was clear, the kind of night when the moon painted the garden silver and the air tasted like secrets. Isla slipped out of her room restless, her bare feet silent against the marble. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the garden where the cherry tree stood in bloom. The petals glimmered pale under the stars. She thought she was alone until she felt his presence. Dominic emerged from the shadows, his expression unreadable yet softer than usual. He did not ask why she was there. He only stopped a few steps away, his gaze drawn to the same moonlight that had stolen her breath. "Can't sleep?" he asked. His voice carried the rough edge of someone who knew what it meant to battle his own nights. She shook her head. "It is not sleep. I cannot find. It is safety. Sometimes I think my heart has not learned it is allowed to rest." Dominic studied her for a long moment before stepping closer. His words came like a promise. "Safety is not something imposed, Isla. It is something cultivated." Her throat tightened. The sincerity in his voice reached deeper than any vow she had ever heard. It stripped away her defenses, leaving her raw. She looked up at him, and for the first time she saw not the billionaire, not the stranger, forced upon her, but a man carved by grief and softened by restraint. "I never thought I would feel this again," she whispered. "This strange thing in my chest, as if I was waiting for you even before I knew you existed." His breath caught the sound almost lost to the rustling leaves. "I did not expect it either. But here we are." The distance between them was fragile. Dominic took one careful step closer, then another. His movements slow, deliberate, like a man afraid to frighten the very thing he desired. Isla did not retreat. She closed her eyes before his lips even touched hers, as though her body had already chosen. The kiss was not urgent, it was hesitant, trembling with the "we"-ite of what it meant. Their lips brushed once, twice, before settling into something deeper, not in passion but in recognition. It was a kiss that carried fear, relief, and the fragile hope that love might bloom even in a place born from chains. Her heart raced, her body shivered not from dread, but from the startling peace of being chosen, not bargained, not traded chosen. When the kiss ended, they remained close foreheads, resting together, their breaths uneven. "Thank you for trusting me," Dominic whispered. The words sank into her skin like warmth on a winter night. Isla's eyes filled with tears. She managed a small smile. "I am still learning, so am I," he replied. And the garden seemed to hold its breath, as though it too knew that something unspoken had just shifted forever, between the silver moonlight and the falling petals. The contract that had begun their story was no longer the only force binding them. Something fragile but real had finally taken root. The storm rolled in without warning. The sky cracked open with thunder and the mansion shuddered under the force of the rain. Lightning lit the hallways like fleeting ghosts. Isla woke with a start, her heart hammering as shadows leapt across the walls. She left her bed, drawn by the flicker of candlelight down the staircase. In the living room, Dominic was there, barefoot in simple clothes, a candle glowing between them. He was pouring hot water into 2 cups, the storm casting jagged light across his face. He looked up as she entered without surprise, as if he had been waiting for her. "Could not sleep either?" she asked, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. He handed her a steaming cup. "Tea works better than fear sometimes." They sat side by side on the sofa. The storm raged outside, but the room felt like a cocoon. The candle flame wavered between them, shadows painting their faces with unspoken thoughts. Isla sipped the tea, its warmth sinking into her veins. Dominic rested back, his expression calm, but his hands betraying tension. They tapped lightly against the porcelain cup. She broke the silence. "Do you believe we can learn to love again after being broken for so long?" The question hung heavy between them. Dominic stared into the candle as if searching for the answer. "Love," he said slowly, "is not born from promises. It grows in the small gestures, in the routines that turn into refuge. Isla felt something collapse inside her walls she had built for years, dissolving like sand under rain. She leaned against him, her head resting carefully on his shoulder. He did not move at first, then his arm shifted slightly, not pulling her closer but steadying himself to bear her weight. She could hear his heartbeat under the storm, steady and real. The thunder shook the windows, but she was no longer afraid. His warmth was more powerful than the noise. She closed her eyes, letting her body trust what her mind still questioned. For the first time, she allowed herself to rest against him without hesitation. Dominic turned his head, his breath brushing her hair. His voice was almost lost to the storm. "The hardest part is not wanting to take care of you." Her chest tightened. The words were not a confession of desire. They were heavier than that. They were an admission of struggle, a battle between restraint and longing. She lifted her head just enough to meet his eyes, and what she saw there was not the cold billionaire everyone feared, but a man unraveling quietly in her presence. The candle burned lower, the storm pounded harder, and yet the silence that stretched between them was tender, not tense. Isla fell asleep against him, her breathing soft and trusting. Dominic did not move. He watched her face by the fragile glow of the flame, and in that moment he knew the contract had already lost its meaning. The storm outside was chaos, but inside the mansion, a fragile home had begun to take shape. The days that followed the storm carried a softness Isla had never known before. The mansion no longer felt like a prison, its silence no longer threatened to swallow her. Instead, it became a place of small rituals. She learned the rhythm of Dominic's footsteps, the sound of his chair scraping back from the dining table, the faint smell of cedar that lingered wherever he passed. She found herself waiting for these details as if they were the only constellations in her sky. One morning, she surprised herself by rising before him. She slipped into the kitchen, clumsy with unfamiliar tools. She cracked eggs, burned toast, and laughed under her breath at the chaos she created. When Dominic entered, his brows lifted at the sight of her apron dusted with flour. She blushed, but he sat down without hesitation, tasting everything as though it were a feast. The corner of his mouth curved upward, and for the first time she saw how beautiful he looked when he allowed himself to smile. Their days were threaded with more than routine. She found herself humming in the halls. He caught her once, spinning barefoot in the library when she thought no one was watching. Instead of mocking, he only said softly, "It suits you to laugh here." She carried those words like a treasure tucked close to her chest. But peace rarely lasts long. A shadow returned in the form of her Uncle Charles. He appeared at the gates, demanding to speak with Dominic. His voice was slick with greed, his eyes sharp with calculation. Isla stood hidden in the corridor as his words slithered into the air. "You have what belongs to us. That girl was raised under my roof. You owe us for the years we carried her." Dominic's posture stiffened, but his tone was steady. "Isla is not a debt. She is my wife." Charles smirked. "She is a transaction. You think I do not know why you agreed to this arrangement? She is obedient, young, perfect for your image. You cannot convince me otherwise." Isla's stomach turned, rage rising like fire in her throat. But before she could step forward, Dominic's voice cut through the room with an edge she had never heard before. "You will never speak of her that way again. She is not yours to sell. She is not mine to own. She is mine because I choose her." The silence that followed was heavy. Isla's hands shook against her dress. The weight of his words struck deeper than any kiss could. Charles sneered, muttered threats about money and reputation, then stormed out, leaving the scent of corruption behind. Dominic turned then, his eyes meeting Isla's across the hall. He had not known she was listening, but he did not flinch from the truth of what he had said. For a moment time seemed to still. She felt her breath catch her heart, trembling as though it had finally heard the answer to a question she had carried for years. That night when she lay awake in the vast bed, she did not think of the chains that had once bound her. She thought of the look in Dominic's eyes when he defended her, not as an obligation, not as a burden, but as a choice. And for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe she was worth choosing. The mansion was quiet, but Isla could not rest. The storm of her uncle's visit still echoed in her veins. His words had reopened old wounds, but it was Dominic's response that haunted her most. He had chosen her. He had spoken it aloud with a certainty that no one had ever given her before. Still doubt whispered in her heart. Was it only anger at her uncle, or did he mean what he said? She wandered through the halls until she reached the study. A faint light spilled from beneath the door. She hesitated, then pushed it open. Dominic sat at the desk, papers spread before him. His shoulders were tense, his hand resting on a folded letter. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in his eyes. "I heard everything she whispered." He did not look surprised. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, Isla." Her hands trembled as she lowered herself into the seat. He leaned back, studying her as though measuring whether she was ready for the truth. Finally, he spoke. "There is something you do not know about why I agreed to this marriage." Her chest tightened, bracing for betrayal. His voice was steady but carried weight. "I knew your name years ago. Isla. It was on a list from a charity for orphans. I kept the document for reasons I could never explain to myself. At first, I only sent quiet support for your schooling anonymous, so you would never know. But when your uncle came to me offering this arrangement, I realized if I did nothing, you would be lost to him forever." Isla's breath caught. She searched his face for signs of deception, but all she found was weary honesty. He continued, "I agreed to marry you, not for an image, not for convenience. I agreed because it was the only way to protect you. I did not touch you because I wanted you to choose for yourself. I could not take away one prison only to build another." Her vision blurred with tears. The truth shattered every wall she had built. Every suspicion. Every fear unraveled, leaving only raw emotion. She stood unable to sit still and paced to the window. The garden lay dark beneath the moonlight, but inside her a light had begun to rise. "You knew me before I ever knew you," she whispered. "You protected me without asking for anything in return." Dominic rose from his chair and crossed the room. He did not reach for her, not yet. His voice lowered. "I did not expect you to feel anything for me. I only wanted you to have the chance to be free. But somewhere along the way I realized freedom is not only being safe, it is being seen, and you, Isla, you have seen me." Her tears slipped free this time, not of sorrow but of release. She turned toward him, closing the space between them. Her hands found his, and for the first time she did not tremble. She looked into his eyes and saw not the cold billionaire the world feared, but the man who had carried her safety quietly in his hands long before she had met him. "I choose to stay," she whispered. And this time it was not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of love. Dominic's arms wrapped around her, holding her, not as possession, but as sanctuary. The mansion no longer felt like stone walls around her, but like a home built from their scars together. Outside, the night carried on with its storms and silences, but inside the two of them stood steady. For the first time in her life, Isla knew she was not a pawn, not a burden, not a debt. She was a choice, and she had chosen him too.